You may think all this stuff that's going on in Ukraine, wherever the hell on the map that is nothing to do with you, but it could actually affect you in your pocket. If you didn't think inflation, which is 7% officially, and I think on some of those American charts is upticking toward double figures already, it's only going to make things worse. If the two biggest countries in Europe go to war. Peter Schiff says that sanctions against Russia, we're not going to be fighting in Russia, we're not going to take on the Red Army, even the Pentagon aren't that stupid. But Peter Schiff says what we're doing instead of going to war, sanctions will only make inflation worse. And he joins me now. Peter, explain this, because people seem to think that Ukraine is just, they've picked a pinprick on the map to arrange a little distraction from whatever's going on at home. But actually, the actions we're taking against Russia are going to make the home front worse.
Well, absolutely. You have to remember that inflation is really just another government tax. It's one of the ways that governments pay for spending. They could take our money legitimately through an income tax or a sales tax, or they can just print money. And when they do that, they create inflation. And so the price of everything we buy goes up. And so instead of paying higher prices, instead of paying higher taxes, we pay higher prices as well. If we sanction Russia, we're going to end up with larger government deficits. Oil prices are obviously going to end up rising as a result of the sanctions. Biden has already indicated that he's going to try to offset the impact on consumers. So the government's going to run bigger deficits. So the Fed's going to have to print even more money as a result of the sanctions. And so we're going to get even more inflation, and prices are going to rise by an even greater degree.
Now, the salient point about American debt has been that it's risen in a time of virtually invisible interest rates, so that it's gone from, I think, 5 trillion to 30 trillion in a nothing period of time. But in that period of time, the cost of borrowing has been zilch, zero. What happens to that $30 trillion? Yeah. So what happens to that debt when paying real amounts of interest in it, suddenly becomes a factor?
Well, if the U.S. government had to pay real interest, the government would default. The main reason that interest rates are still so low is because the government can't afford higher interest rates. And of course, ironically, by keeping interest rates so low for so long, the Federal Reserve encouraged an overly indebted U.S. government to go even deeper into debt. For years, Congress was saying we should take advantage of these low interest rates by borrowing more money. And I kept saying, well, that's like saying, we should take advantage of free heroin by injecting it. Just because something is free doesn't mean you do it. And the risk is always, well, what happens when it's no longer free? What happens when interest rates go up? Because we don't have $30 trillion worth of debt locked up in 30-year Treasury bonds. Most of it is in short-term Treasury bills. Like during the housing bubble, a lot of Americans took out adjustable rate mortgages, so they didn't lock in their low interest rate for 30 years. They had a teaser rate, and when interest rates went up, they could no longer afford to make the mortgage payments, and so they walked away. If the Fed actually raised interest rates sufficiently to fight inflation, there is no way the U.S. government could service the debt, let alone repay it, and it would have to default. So to prevent the default, we're going to run the presses full steam. Inflation is not going to go away. It's just getting started in the United States, and it's going to get much, much worse.
America is not Greece or Zimbabwe, because its currency is the global reserve currency, which is a huge advantage. Not only Putin, but Chairman Xi and the Ayatollahs in Tehran, at some point they're going to want to yank the rug out from under the dollar, aren't they?
Well, especially when we use it as a weapon, when we try to sanction people by, denying Russia access to U.S. dollar payment system. Obviously, that doesn't sit well with the Chinese, who are wondering if we might do the same thing to them. But the only reason America has been able to live beyond its means is because of the dollar's reserve status. The only reason we can run these huge budget deficits and trade deficits, the only reason we were able to get away with all this quantitative easing was because the world valued the fiat currency that we created out of thin air. But when they stop valuing it, when they no longer want to stockpile it, when they no longer want to exchange the goods that they produce for the paper that we print, the party is over. We're going to have a sovereign debt crisis, a currency crisis, and the American standard of living is going to plunge because we're going to be forced to live within our means. And unfortunately, those means have been dramatically diminished over the years. On the flip side, this is actually going to be very positive for the rest of the world because they will no longer have the burden of supporting and subsidizing the U.S. economy. The world will be able to consume more of what it produces and invest more of what it saves rather than diverting those resources and those goods to Americans.
So your view of this is that this is a uniquely perilous... I mean, you're right in the macro picture. I mean, generally speaking, Denmark and Norway and Sweden tax their peoples for what their governments spend. In America, in Washington, one political party talks about small government all the time. In fact, it's a big government that's just basically put the debt on its great-grandkids' credit cards. But the problem is it's going to come to a crisis long before the great-grandkids.
Well, it's already a crisis. It's a crisis right now. The only reason we were able to kick the can down the road for as long as we did with quantitative easing and stimulus was because we could pretend that inflation was too low. The Federal Reserve kept saying that we don't have enough inflation, it's lower than 2%, even though the way they measured it was wrong, and that the whole time they were pretending it was below 2%, it was well above it. Well, now they can't pretend anymore. Inflation is so bad that they can't lie about it. I mean, they can still claim it's 7.5 when it's really 15, but even 7.5% is too much, and so they can't do this anymore. And so now they're caught, in this box, and there's no way out because they can't fight inflation, but they can't admit that they can't fight inflation because either way we have a crisis.
Yeah, I remember you saying, hearing a speech of yours a couple of years ago, just before the COVID kicked in which you were saying, talking about the Dow Jones being worth less than your cufflinks at a certain point. I take it you've kind of advanced the coming of that scenario after what's been going on in the last couple of years.
Well, that's because that particular pair of cufflinks was made out of 24-karat gold. So yes, I mean, I do think that the nominal value of those cufflinks will exceed the Dow because there's going to be a tremendous amount of inflation. Unfortunately, that's the less, that's the viable way out, policy-wise. Of course, I think that's the worst choice. I think a better choice would be to restructure the debt and admit the truth, but politicians never do that. They never want to accept responsibility. They always want to blame others, and so we're going to keep on printing money. The government's not going to default. The debt's going to be repudiated through inflation. Holders of U.S. dollars are going to suffer a tremendous loss in the purchasing power of those dollars as the price of goods and services rise dramatically as a result of the loss of value of the U.S. dollar. And of course, when the dollar loses its reserve currency status, which I think we're on the cusp of doing right now, that will simply accelerate the dollar's demise.
Okay, you heard those words, folks, the dollar's demise. Thank you, Peter, and don't wear those cufflinks when you're strolling around the seedy part of town.